My name is Cary Bryczek. I'm the Director of Solution Architecture for Aerospace and Defense at Jama Software. And I'm going to give a follow-on talk to Lou Wheatcraft and talk about what libraries of requirements and standards and regulations might look like in a requirements tool, specifically our requirements tool. So there are different types of standards and regulations, and it's important to kind of recognize the differences. And Lou pointed this out as well. I think there's 4 different types. We have, product kinds of requirements that describe the characteristics of the product that's going to guarantee the quality or safety. So you might have something like, as an example, ISO 26262. Then you have service requirements as well. And these service requirements kind of define the obligations of both the provider, the developer of the system or service, and the user's responsibilities, so that it's very clear. And a lot of times this is kind of used to establish, what's the minimum kind of quality for a specific service. And that's an example out there for medical laboratories to use. So for collecting and transporting and receipt and handling of different types of medical samples. And then we have process types of standards and regulations, and these are conditions and requirements which apply to kind of like the development and the production, packaging and storing and testing of the overall development. So as an example, might be DO-178C, which defines for the software processes that you have to follow when you're developing avionics systems. And then a management type of regulation or standard might be something that's very broad. ISO 9001 for quality management systems really comes to mind. And so you're going to manage these types of regulations and standards a little differently from each other. And I'll show some examples as well. A process standard might just be an input into different types of standard operating procedures that you might have. In many ways, it might be okay to leave that overall standard, ISO 9001 in a document format. You're generally not going to be using them as line level requirements and having to produce traceable evidence to the line level. So it's often really good to just keep them as a document. And then so to provide sort of the evidence that you have followed the particular process standard, you're going to have a plethora of process documentation that describe the different types of processes that you follow. And I'm thinking about like CMMI as well. So you might have a different process documentation, different peer reviews of that documentation, checklists to confirm that you've actually created the documentation. You might have these outside adjudicators come in and assess from a quality standpoint whether you followed that particular process standpoint. And then the assessment might be the evidence that you might give as part of your deliverable, your line item. Yes, we did follow the ISO 9000 or CMMI level 3, and here's our certificate. And so the other categories of standards or regulations, they might lend themselves really well to sort of being managed at that line level, that element level, that paragraph or that statement or the bullet point, depending upon the quality of the way they wrote the requirements inside the standard. And they might be well suited to get managed in a requirements library or your requirements tool like Jama Connect. There are some advantages to then managing these types of standards inside of an RM tool. One, they can be configuration managed, and you can show the evolution as well. So, as you tailor or as the particular requirement changes in some way, you can capture, who made the change, what was the rationale, what was the commenting around that sort of a thing. those individual requirements then become consumable too. I really like to use this word consumable because, when you're a software engineer or a tester, you don't want to have to waste your time poring over a Word document or examining, thousands of rows of a spreadsheet. You want it in the tool that you're using, your requirements tool, so that you can, have that trace to your test. So you could, categorize and search things in a logical way. So making them consumable is a real advantage of, putting your standards into a requirements tool. And then, when they're in there, you can classify them. You can use attributes and tags to classify them, to make them easier to search, easier to manage and understand where they're being used, what's the rationale, how are you testing them, that sort of a thing. And then when you do have them in a RARM tool, it becomes natural and easy to trace them to other requirements, to trace them to V&V data, and then you can reuse them too. So, when you have them in a Word document, it's very hard they're not marked up in any way. You don't know the evolution of that, but in an RM tool, it's easy to reuse those and have libraries of them, so that you can see which projects are using which requirements, and then you can tailor them too. So when you have them in the tool, it's easy for you to say, yep, this one is not applicable. These are applicable. Here's how I'm going to sort of categorize them. And then, it becomes easy as well to see which projects are using which standards. And in some cases, as standards evolve, maybe the aviation system that we built 10 years ago was using a slightly earlier version than standard. But the newer one has to adhere to the latest and greatest standards. So it's nice to be able to see, that sort of turning of the lens to see which projects are using which and which version of the standard as well. It's nice to be able to have that collaboration content inside the standard as well, to better understand what is that particular requirement really saying, what's the rationale for the way we interpret it, have those discussions, 10 years from now, when you're having to use these particular requirements that are in the standards, that you really understand how they were interpreted when they first came in. And doing this, it is difficult and it is time consuming when there's hundreds of thousands of individual lines of these requirements. But as you build your library, over time, you're going to really reap the benefit of those, of taking the time to really import your requirements and sort of curate them in a meaningful way. I'm just going to jump right into a demonstration. Let's just look at a requirement document. So here's an example of a bunch of requirements in a Word document, and then sometimes you get them redlined from these different agencies. This one's from the European Space Agency, but they are very lengthy, 132 pages of stuff. And so bringing this sort of information into a requirements tool then makes it kind of consumable to engineers. I have each individual element now becomes its own object. So if I go to the testing section and look at something, I can see, here's the description of, here's this one line. I know it came from this particular section. And so I've, managed it in my standards library in a really nice way that I can always go back and point out which section it particularly came from. I'm capable to have notes on it. I might want to capture comments on there, how are we going to support that? And then because it's in its own individual section, when I want to reuse parts of this. I might not need all of this particular standard for the piece of space equipment that I'm making. Maybe, I'm not doing solar cell assemblies, but I'm doing photovoltaic assemblies. So maybe only these parts of the standard are relevant to my particular project. Here's another example. This one's sort of an aerospace one. This is right from the US Code of Federal Regulations. So this is, our CFR Part 23. And these are just individual requirements for weight and center of gravity. And when we pull those in here, you can see, again, where it came from. Here, again, each individual piece of the standard is its own element, its own, you want to think of it as a model base, it's its own model base. So now me as an engineer and a tester, I see the individual line item, and then I can trace and create tests for this. I can trace this particular requirements, or I could develop a checklist that allows me to check for this kind of thing. I can have different attributes that allow me to classify it, to capture the right information, that make it usable for my particular system. And then sometimes you might have some requirements where I just have a list, and some of these might be really big. I just show some of these lists as different standards. I might not want to import each individual line item from each of these standards, but I still need to comply with these. So here's an example where I've kind of described what the standard is, and then how do I demonstrate my conformity to that particular kind of standard. And it might be a report, it might be some kind of test that I have to run, or an assessment report. So this is another way that really, helps people, manage these particular types of regulatory requirements. Don't lend themselves to, individual line items, but I have to look at them in whole, in a big way. Here's an example where you might develop checklists. So, like for DO 178, it's a process standard, right? So, they want you to capture the information and perform systems engineering, software and systems engineering in a certain way. So you might need to develop checklists and reuse these checklists from project to project to project. So it's nice to be able to have checklists for different types of regulations. And this particular checklist is only applicable to DO 178. You could easily develop checklists for just about any kind of process standard out there. And so one of the great things that I think Jama does is allow you to sort of capture this information in a library. I've got different types of requirements in this particular library. And then when I want to go and use those particular requirements in a new project, I can come in and say, hey, I'm just going to show a very simple example in this. So if I have corporate requirements, I'm the systems engineer and I need to bring these requirements into my new project, I might want to say, what, do I need all of these? Or I'm going to bring them all in, and then I'm going to decide which ones I need and which ones I don't. One of the other strengths that at least Jama has is pre-establishing traces between requirements and between tests. So in this example, I have a requirement for a color for a corporate logo, but I also have a test case or several test cases traced to it. And I want to bring in the tests as well, so that when I have my software team perform testing against these standards, these are corporate standards, but that they can do that as well. So when I reuse this, I'm going to take it from my corporate library where I'm managing those, and I might have a team that's overseeing maintenance of my regulatory requirements and standards. I'll put this over into, I'm just going to pick a random project. Then I'm going to keep them in sync. So as I make changes to requirements here in my master library, I might want to be able to see which projects are using those requirements and have the option to synchronize any changes. So Jama really nicely lets you do that. So I'm going to push them over there into this Achiever project, and then we'll go and take a look at them and maybe pretend that I'm the project manager over here now, and I want to start tailoring and determining, do all of these particular requirements pertain to this particular project or not? Jama says, hey, I don't really need that. The corporate slogan doesn't matter to me. Do I want to get rid of that? And so I can get rid of that. Maybe for this particular effort, I need to tailor some requirements as well. So I can come in and tailor that particular requirement by editing it in some way. Maybe this one, I'll just do, this is blue 789. So I have the option to do that. I might also be forced to completely adhere to any requirements that came in from the library. So I could also optionally lock everything down if I wanted to prevent any tailoring. I might also need to create new additional requirements. So if I wanted to add something additional to this is my additional, logo details. Right. We'll just save that as part of this. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with the requirements. I'm going to jump back over to my corporate library project where I have my regulations and standards. One of the things I might want to do is see what projects are using these regulations, to what extent are they using them? So I can now take a view and see which projects in my system are using them. So now I see that they're being used in 5 different other projects. And here's that UAV project that I was looking at. And maybe I want to see, maybe time has gone forward and maybe some of the corporate requirements have changed. Maybe some of these requirements in the individual projects have evolved in some way. So I can do a comparison between what I have in my library and what I have in my individual projects. Here's that one that I actually made a little edit of. So I changed it from 456, which is what's in the corporate library, to 789, which is what's in the individual UAV project. And then in some cases, I might want to do a synchronization. Maybe at some point I've developed new corporate requirements and I want to push those into another project, or maybe I've developed requirements. Maybe the UAV project had some special regulatory requirements that they imported into that project, and they developed them and went through an adjudication phase, and they want to pull those back into your corporate library. You can synchronize bidirectionally information. Here's one that's missing. This corporate slogan was one that I deleted, so that one doesn't exist in the UAV project. If I wanted to pull this 789 into the corporate library, I could pull that and bring that back in as well. Or if I absolutely wanted to push this corporate slogan and force that back in because now we need that, and maybe the contract changed and now we have to have that corporate slogan in there. I can put that back over into my project. So now when we look at the corporate branding, right, we had the color, it has the 789 now. If I go back and I look at the achiever and I look at the requirements that were over there, it should have those. There's that logo is back in there that we pushed over. So that's our capabilities to do reuse, and it's fairly streamlined. There really are a lot of different ways that I've seen customers take on these libraries. A lot of people are pulling in and wanting to parse these things out. We at Jama have taken the effort to actually pull some of the more popular standards out there, at least from the aerospace and defense side, and pre-populate them in our tools so we make those available to our customers. We have techniques for importing standards and regulations from different systems, things that come in Word documents. We have methods, easy ways to pull those in, or some of these came in as the requirements interchange format. Just gonna kind of pause and see if you guys have any questions, or maybe there were some questions that I saw in the Zoom.
I have a question there for Cary. This is Tammy. So I just, coming off of Lou's presentation, going into this is just perfect. And Lou brought up that not everything, well, there's always some sort of verification concept, but you understand that there are different types of requirements, right? There's processes, there's, as you call it, that higher level ISO 9000 kind. So that gets in the category of there are different kinds of requirements that might be mixed in together into a standard. Would you find a way that somebody could tag or put an attribute so that if it's one kind of requirement, we'll take one type of compliance approach, and if it's a different kind, like against the product, that flags it to go into the requirement set for that product? I mean, it's just a nice way to be able to categorize them somehow.
It will vary depending upon the industry, and it will vary depending upon the product, right? So if it's a specification for how you're supposed to design a component of a medical device, hey, it has to have a certain kind of coating and protective measures, and that gets imported as a requirement, that absolutely should be included at the product requirement, whether that's at the system requirement or the subsystem item level. But you're going to have to, one, in your Jama, or in your requirements world, decide how you're going to do, requirements leveling. I'm trying to think if I have an example here. How do you divide up your requirements to begin with? Is a higher level process requirement, maybe you manage it at a higher level than a system requirement, or that lower level specification for how to apply the coding to the medical device piece of hardware, or the space component. Maybe that it's managed at the high level and incorporated as a high level requirement, but then you might need to keep them segregated. It might be of a type of high level requirement, and so it would essentially inherit all of the types of attributes that you would be managing for high level requirements, but then you might keep them segregated as well. So as an example, so if I'm working at these high level software requirements, you might want to segregate them, and so these might be regulatory requirements. So here you can segregate them by location. So in this particular example, anything that would be living inside of this folder, it's a high level requirement, but it's a regulatory requirement. Or as you said, if you wanted to specifically tag something, you might tag something with a field. So pretend derived says, regulatory or non-regulatory. You could tag it with some kind of pick list, or you could actually add a tag and say, this came from ISO 9001, or whatever particular design regulatory specification you had for a coating or whatever. So depending upon your requirements tool, you could organize it in a certain way to keep them segregated. You could tag them. You could have some kind of attribute that captures where it came from, or you may even have a link. Maybe you just have a link to the ECFR. Hey, we need to satisfy this weight and center of gravity, and you could add, maybe a link to something. It really depends upon the type of regulatory requirement it is. Do you need to manage it granularly? Is this weight and center of gravity? Do I include that in my product requirements, or do I manage those separately? At least from the Jama side, if you manage them separately, then if you have a library, the management of the library becomes a lot easier. You have the whole thing, and you're managing all of these regulations in one place. And when you start intermingling them inside of your product requirements, it might become more difficult over time. Keep regulatory requirements synchronized or query where they're used. You have to really think about it and judge. Not all requirements are equal. You might manage some regulatory requirements one way, and you might manage some regulatory requirements in another way. It's a cost trade-off too, right? It's expensive and it takes a lot of time.
Thank you. I think you were getting to the heart of what I was asking. Were you prepared for other folks to ask questions? I didn't know if you had much more you wanted to showcase.
Yeah, I wanted to keep it simple. So if other people had questions or wanted to lead the discussion down a different track, I'm totally open for that.
This is Lou. In my presentation, I talked about the concept of applicability matrix. There's always a question about, I guess, push-pull, top-down allocation versus kind of a bottom-up kind of a selection of applicability. It seems like when a project is formed within a company at the corporate level or the business operations level, they would want to be able to, through a simple process of checking boxes, say which standards and regulations apply to which projects.
Yeah, I mean, you could create, at least on the Jama side, here's your list of standards and regulations, and then you could determine which projects it conform to. Just imagine you had another column in here that said, yep, this is this, it applies to this project and this project. And then when you actually wanted to go and reuse those requirements, if you wanted to take the requirements and actually put them into the projects, you could easily see, hey, this particular set of corporate requirements is applying to those. This would be your library. You just kind of click and see which particular projects are using that, and then you can push them around to the right projects. But it's still going to be up to the individual teams in each of these development efforts to actually use the regulatory requirements. I mean, having an applicability matrix, it's nice to see, hey, these are all the requirements, and now do we need that or not? Yes. Then you're going to go and actually take those requirements for each one of these and push the applicable one into your project.
Yeah, so from a management standpoint, I don't want to leave it up to projects to choose which standards or regulations they're compliant with. I'm going to tell them.
Of course. Yeah, you're going to have somebody in your organization that is like the compliance auditor. Yeah, that's the contract manager. So that person comes in here and says, here's my giant library of all the regulations. I'm looking at my contract, looking at my product. I'm analyzing which ones are applicative, and then I can just do check, 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 check.
Yeah, and
And-
that's what I was talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Then they can just check off the ones, but then project manager can say, oh, here's the ones that apply to my product. Let me pull those into my project individually.
That's why I had the two matrices. I had the one where management said these standards and regulations you got to show compliance with. And then at the project level, then they further decompose those. Are these requirements on my processes? Are these requirements on my testing? Are these requirements on my product itself? And then they could further assign those. So then
Yeah.
if they want to go look at all their product requirements, all the ones that were selected would show up there, and then they could select requirements, which ones they think apply individually, and then they could drive well-formed requirements to meet the intent of that regulatory requirement and establish traceability to it, as well as that chain of evidence that the design implemented that requirement, and then we have verification that the requirement was met. And at the top level, that person you're talking about, that compliance person, then they would have access to the chain of evidence that says, yeah, we said you got to be compliant with all these, and here's all the evidence that you were compliant.
Yep, that's the objective. Any other kind of questions?
We talked earlier about the difference between, say, the technical requirements and process requirements and testing verification requirements, even management style requirements. In some sense, is it the case that process requirements, management requirements, even testing and verification requirements are requirements about a different system? It's the system that is building the system of this interest. And so we have requirements of a system of interest, which might be the product or service that the entity is producing. But then there's also requirements that apply to the organization that's doing the design and construction. And so when you were talking earlier about, well, we could highlight regulatory requirements. Well, the regulatory requirements are very famous for mixing all that together. So is there, like, as a procedure or process for doing this, the first step is to kind of import the regulatory standard kind of raw, and it looked like this is sort of what you were doing. You import it kind of raw, and then we add a little bit of metadata on top of it. We don't use this directly. We have another 2 or 3 collection of needs or collection of requirements where this one is specifying the SOI that we are constructing. This set is specifying how we construct it. And so right away, you start segregating into the project those that are describing your own organization and how you do your work, and a separate system, which is what you're producing, whether it's a product or a service.
Exactly. Just like you said, you can capture these individual, regulatory requirements and bring them into a system like Jama so that you have them. I mean, some of these are going to be process. And when you have them inside of your regulatory library, then you can add different categories to them. You can add individual commenting and clarification on what that is. And that all of this information then becomes available to your projects. So when you're working in these projects, I have all of the information that I captured from my library. I have that available to me here, whether it's a process or whether it's, if I have to do a checklist against that, or if I have to develop, a procedure guide that my team is going to follow, I would have that information captured, organizationally on the individual pieces. If it becomes sort of a product requirement and I have to test it, then I could have my tests as well along with it. Yeah, it is a tedious process, but there's high value in getting it right and developing your library of your regulations. And I think a lot of people are kind of doing it. I mean, they're kind of doing it in Word documents and spreadsheets. It's just another step to educating those types of individuals to how to use a requirements tool or, electronic system to capture that kind of information so that the information about your regulatory requirements becomes consumable. You're eliminating the stovepipes and all of that duplicate effort, project to project to project.
This is Henrik Whirlpool. I mean, we do a similar thing there. I mean, we have the regulatory specs and I mean, they are often organized in different classes. And then as kind of Lou said, I mean, whatever in those different classes in the regulatory standards, I mean, they can either apply directly to the system of interest, can be on the test kind of system or to the organization. But I mean, if you treat them at least as kind of in the stakeholder space, I mean, you have the freedom to decompose them into more than one system, but it's probably most common that you have a requirement set for your engineered system, but maybe not for the other ones, and you're kind of lacking a little bit rigor there. But I mean, there's nothing that prevents you from doing that, right? But it's probably very common to work with, I'm focusing on my developed system and not so much on the people system or the test system.
I definitely see more commonality pulling in regulatory requirements or standards that are more technical in nature into a tool like Jama so that they can be
Right.
used in libraries. Yeah.
But the advantage with at least having the different classes, for example, there is that, I mean, you can create that traceability up to those classes, or you can see how they kind of decompose downstream. Mm-hmm. Even if they may decompose to more than one system of interest, actually.
Sure, absolutely.
It's kind of interesting, what Heinrich's talked about too is that as system engineers, we tend to focus on the technical side. And so when you talk about a requirement management tool, historically, we're thinking about strictly the technical requirements being managed in a requirement management tool. Mm-hmm. Whereas we could also have a separate section, I guess, that deals with the processes. So in that chart that I showed, all the design controls that are requirements on how the organization is going to produce the product, those could all be maintained too, so the organizations can clearly show that they're compliant with all the process requirements, management requirements, separately from the technical requirements. Tammy was alluding to also is that, how you verify those, how you meet those are different. Like in the case of a lot of the process requirements, they wouldn't be implemented as much by the individual projects as you'd have a generic process developed by the organization that all the projects are expected to follow. It's not a choice. We are ISO XXX compliant, and we have these design controls in place to show compliance, and project, you're expected to follow that. And in your work instructions and your procedures would all be developed generically for the class of projects that are developed within the organization.
And sometimes it's actually even more complicated than that. It could be, for example, if your system is performing a safety critical function and you happen to allocate that to a specific system element, then, okay, that will get extra regulatory requirements. And now suddenly the development team need to follow certain procedures, which they wouldn't have need to do if that safety critical function would have been allocated to a different part of the system, kind of through the architecting process. So, I mean, this is pretty complicated, actually. That's why we still need humans to kind of do this analysis and perform correct allocation and clarify, okay, given this kind of scenario, here's this set of stuff that applies.
That's a different type of applicability too. Like for medical devices, they've got class 1, 2, and 3 devices, and each one has slightly, different regulations that apply depending if you're class 1, 2, or 3. So in a library like this, you could make that an attribute. This applies to class 1, this applies to class 2, this applies to class 3. And then if your system of interest is the class 3, then you could select all the regulations and standards that apply to a class 3 system of interest.
Hey, Lou, I have a question. It's Ashley here. So when you talk about processes as opposed to technical requirements, you're talking about upper level processes, the what, right? What you're going to do to make the product rather than the how. Is that correct?
I think, yes, that's what he meant. You know, the what, you know, hey, we're following ISO 26262. We're developing an automotive, right? That's an upper level process. Right.
Well, it's Mike Ryan. And I think it also harks back to what the distinction Lou was making between processes and products and people. That the requirement is, if the requirement is a process requirement, it'll be on somebody to do. So it'll be a requirement which is allocated to somebody to perform rather than on the product to actually have as a feature when it's verified or validated.
For example, how design reviews are conducted, like, right?
Right.
Yeah, and you know, who's responsible for the regulatory process, or who's responsible for the T&E, rather than the actual verification of the requirement itself. Okay,
I was just trying to, I was thinking about those processes at the lower level.
Yeah, but I think it probably still follows down in when you do the elaboration of requirements. So if there's a system level requirement between the customer and the contractor, it will be, you know, the contractor shall, you know, have a project management plan in accordance with. And then the project management plan will say so-and-so shall, you know, develop a schedule, so-and-so shall, whereas the system requirements then get decomposed to be the system shall, and then the subsystem shall, and then the component shall, or whatever. Keeping that idea that the process is going to be implemented by somebody. It still has to be costed and part of the work breakdown structure, but it's not a feature of the system itself per se. It's a feature of the way in which the system was developed.
Yeah, for example, the requirements that would be in a statement of work would be on the supplier, both activities and deliverables, whereas the technical requirements would be in a separate set of design input system requirements on the system itself.
I got it. Possibly attached to a process specification or the like. Okay.
I find this topic utterly fascinating, and I'm really appreciative of both Lou and Cary for bringing this to us. Are there any other questions for Cary? This is a wonderful demonstration, by the way. It's really nice to see how something like this could be done. Cary, did you have anything else for the team?
Nope, just thank you so much for letting me share. I really enjoy it. And, you know, I would love to talk further and brainstorm on different ways to leverage an RM tool for helping manage, you know, standards and requirements.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.